Hello, students. Welcome to the introduction lesson for for Unit 1 of Sacraments. So Unit 1 is going to be chapters 1 and 2. But this introduction lesson is a supplement to your textbook, and it's going to focus on the nature of the human person and how that relates to the sacraments. So let's get started. Okay, so these are our learning objectives for the chapter. So define Erickson's stages of psychosocial development, describe Fowler's stages of faith development, explain the connection between the findings of psychology and the sacraments, and then justify the statement, the sacraments are not merely religious ritual, they represent a religious expression of natural human development. So those are your objectives, and that's what you'll be able to do by the end of this lesson. Okay, so before we start talking about the sort of psychological development of the human person, you're going to go to classwork 2 on PowerSchool, and there's a description of the assignment there. You will receive in class a hard copy of the handouts for this assignment, and it's going to happen in 2 parts. The first part is a pie chart with quotes from the Catechism. If you're absent, please see me to get a copy of that. So the first thing you do before we start anything, the warm-up, is to read the selections from the Catechism on the handout and note the role the sacraments play in different phases of our lives. Plot where the sacraments might fall on the pie chart, and some will overlap. And keep the chart handy to take notes when we talk about the relationship between sacraments and human development. So again, this is classwork 2.1. It's the first part, and again, it's a hard copy. I do have digital copies on PowerSchool, but if you're absent, see me for the hard copy. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is Erickson's stages of psychosocial development. Erickson theorized that one's culture and experiences of the external world have a big impact on their human development. Freud was one of the first people to kind of look at the way people develop over time and how their childhood has an impact on their adulthood. But Erickson was the first one to kind of bring in a larger culture, and he shows the impact of social experience on the individual. And so we're going to watch just a little video that goes over his 8 stages. As you watch it, don't worry about knowing what each stage is, but as you listen to the type of development that happens in stages, think about how that might be related to the sacraments, and see if you can see a connection between where the sacraments fall in our lives and our natural human development.
Erickson's theory of psychosocial development identifies 8 stages which a healthy individual should pass through from birth to death. At each stage, we encounter different needs, ask new questions, and meet people who influence our behavior and learning. Stage 1. Basic trust versus mistrust. As infants, we ask ourselves if we can trust the world, and we wonder if it's safe. We learn that if we can trust someone now, we can also trust others in the future. If we experience fear, we develop doubt and mistrust. The key to our development is our mother. Stage 2. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. In our early childhood, we experience ourselves and discover our body. We ask, is it okay to be me? If we are allowed to discover ourselves, then we develop self-confidence. If we are not, we can develop shame and self-doubt. Both parents now play a major role. Stage 3. Initiative versus guilt. In preschool, we take initiative, try out new things, and learn basic principles like how round things roll. We ask, is it okay for me to do what I do? If we are encouraged, we can follow our interests. If we are held back or told that what we do is silly, we can develop guilt. We are now learning from the entire family. Stage 4. Industry versus inferiority. Now we discover our own interests and realize that we are different from others. We want to show that we can do things right. We ask if we can make it in this world. If we receive recognition from our teachers or peers, we become industrious, which is another word for hard-working. If we get too much negative feedback, we start to feel inferior and lose motivation. Our neighbors and schools now influence us the most.
And so notice this is the time
Stage
when
5.
First
Identity
Communion
versus
happens.
role confusion. During adolescence, we learn that we have different social roles. We are friends, students, children, and citizens. Many experience an identity crisis. If our parents now allow us to go out and explore, we can find identity. If they push us to conform to their views, we can face role confusion and feel lost. Key to our learning are our peers and role models. Stage 6. Intimacy versus isolation. As young adults, we slowly understand who we are, and we start to let go of the relationships we had built earlier in order to fit in. We ask ourselves if we can love. If we can make a long-term commitment, we are confident and happy. If we cannot form intimate relationships, we might end up feeling isolated and lonely. Our friends and partners are now central to our development. Stage 7. Generativity versus stagnation. When we reach our 40s, we become comfortable, use our leisure time creatively, and maybe begin contributing to society. Our concern is generativity. If we think that we are able to lead the next generation into this world, we are happy. If we did not resolve some conflicts earlier, we can become pessimistic and experience stagnation. People at home and at work are now who influences the most. Stage 8. Ego integrity versus despair. As we grow older, we tend to slow down and begin to look back over our lives. We ask, "How have I done?" If we think we did well, we develop feelings of contentment and integrity. If not, we can experience despair and become grumpy and bitter. Time to compare us with mankind. Erik Erikson was a German-American psychologist who, together with his wife Joan, became known for his work on psychosocial development. He was influenced by Sigmund and Anna Freud and became famous for coining the phrase identity crisis. Although Erikson lacked even a bachelor's degree, he served as a professor at Harvard and Yale.
Okay, so let's
This
talk about
video
this.
was made for us by Minute Video.
Okay, so this would be a class discussion on this page. So if you're watching this because you're absent, you can just consider these questions and I'll help you think about them. What aspects of Erikson's theory do you find valuable for the study of the sacraments? And what aspects do you question? So this would happen in a class discussion. So I'm going to kind of think about it a little bit with you here. So thinking about Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, one of the key things that Erikson points out in every stage is the role of one's culture and the other, your relationships in forming identity. If you noticed, at every single stage, he would talk about what development was going on and who was involved in the development. So in the first stage, it's the mother. In the second stage, it's the mother and the father, and so forth. And so, Freud really focused at what was going on inside the person and the internal struggles, whereas Erikson is focusing more on how we have this not just interaction of the mind, but also of the body and cultural influences, which was a very good, important insight. For us as Catholics, when we look at this, we can see, well, this is what the church is all about. The church is the community that Jesus founded, that was supposed to help us grow in our faith and how we're supposed to receive the sacraments. So this kind of shows us sort of God's providence, or Jesus's providence, in giving us the church. He knew we needed a culture to grow to be healthy individuals. So he didn't just give us a book. He didn't just give us a philosophy. He gave us a church that would help us to develop as human individuals and as people of faith. Another thing you might have noticed is, depending on the stage of development, the sacrament kind of goes along with the stage. So in stage 1, he said it was all about trust. And in that stage, we have baptism. So baptism is a way of welcoming a baby into the faith community, into the church. And it's kind of saying to this little baby, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to raise you in the faith. I'm going to say yes to baptism for you, so you can have the benefit of this church community around you from the very get-go. So that was like stage 1. Notice he talked about in stage 2, it was, or maybe it was stage 3, in ages 3 to 5, he talked about how that's where you develop guilt if you're not encouraged enough. And then in the stage that was from 5 to 11 years old, he said that's when you learn to follow rules and kind of put yourself in the context of others. So Catholics, at the age of 7, this is what we call the age of reason. So in between these two stages, this is when you get communion, right? So it happens usually in 2nd grade. So you've already have the capacity. Guilt can be a bad thing, or it could be a good thing. What guilt is, it's when you feel bad for doing something you know is wrong. So guilt isn't a bad thing necessarily. It helps you to correct bad behavior. Guilt becomes a problem when you feel bad for doing things that aren't wrong. That would be a form of neuroses. But notice where communion would come right in between these two phases, where you have the ability to follow rules. In this stage, you're also kind of looking a little bit more outward. You're have this ability to follow rules now. So this is where you do your first reconciliation, and now you have the ability to understand what communion means. So now you can receive Eucharist, and it kind of brings you more into the community. Then in the sort of adolescent stage, that's when you have you are looking for a sense of identity, and you may have some confusion about your role in life. And so at this stage, parents are supposed to encourage you, not push you too hard. And your peers become very important in understanding who you are. And so this is precisely when we have confirmation. Because if you're asking, well, what is my identity in this stage? Who am I? Jesus gave us the sacrament of confirmation to answer that question. Before, your parents said yes for you. Now that you're old enough, Jesus is saying, now you need to figure out, do I want to be Catholic? Am I a Catholic? Is this my identity? And remember, unlike these stages that happen in specific times in life, like between 18 to 11, 11 to 18, I said it wrong. The sacraments don't necessarily have to happen then. So, for example, many of you maybe were confirmed when you were teenagers. I wasn't ready for that. I couldn't accept the identity of Catholic until I was in my 20s. So I got confirmed later. So that would be a big difference between these stages of development and the sacraments. The sacraments are following not only your natural human development, but your spiritual development as well. One other thing I wanted to point out about the Erickson's stages here is I wanted to make, I don't know what I just did. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to point out was when he talks about oh, hang on, maybe I can move that down there. Oh. When he talks about 18 to 40, he also mentioned that's the stage that you focus on relationships versus isolation. And as Catholics, we know this is where the sacraments of marriage come in. Or if you're called to a different vocation, holy orders. Holy orders would be those who are ordained to the diaconate and priesthood. So just Erickson identifies in this is when you're looking for relationship. That's when the exact time where most Christians and Catholics will experience the sacrament of marriage. So once again, we're seeing that in his scientific analysis, his psychological analysis of human development, we're seeing that our sacraments kind of fit in the timeline of the human person. So as you're growing as a person, intellectually and emotionally, Jesus gave the sacraments to help us grow. That's supposed to say grow spiritually. So it kind of shows, God's divine providence. Jesus would never have used this language, but remember, he has both the mind of God and the human experience. So it kind of shows how there's this beautiful kind of sacramentality coming together here with, grace is cooperating with human development. Okay, so now let's take a look at Fowler. Okay, now we're going to look at Fowler's stages of faith development. Fowler wrote his book, I think it was 1983. It was called, I think it was called, I'm forgetting the name of it, but he talked about different stages in faith development. So he was influenced by the developmental psychology of Erickson and Paget, and he kind of applied it to people's spiritual life. So rather than looking at religion, which kind of has a negative connotation today, he looked at faith. Because he said faith is a universal quality of human life. Everybody kind of has a faith in something. Paul Tillich was Tillich. I don't know if I spelled his name right. Tillich, Tillich. I might have spelt it wrong, but he was one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. And he, rather than speaking about religion, talked about faith, and he defined it as ultimate cause. So he wanted to distinguish. He didn't want faith to be reduced to only a belief in God, because some people put other things at the center of their world, and it operates the same way as faith does for a religious person. So for Paul Tillich, it was whatever your ultimate cause is, that's your faith. That's your religion. So in Fowler's work, he looked at people from all kinds of different religious traditions, and he followed people for a long time and saw how their faith developed over a lifetime. It was a very big and intensive study. So he came up with what are called the stages of faith development, and they're not meant to be evaluative scale. So this is very important. When we read this, we might think, oh, geez, I'm only on stage 3. That means I'm not a very faithful person. It's not a value judgment. Faith develops naturally over time. So, you don't have to, if I'm only on stage 3, that's bad. That means I'm not a good, faithful person. People at every stage can be sincere and at peace with their faith. And the stages are just snapshots. So there's still shots in the overall lifespan of a person of faith. So I just wanted to highlight some things here that Fowler kind of pointed out that I find interesting. So if we look at stage 1, this is right here, the early intuitive projective faith, so early childhood. It says intuitive images of good and evil, fantasy and reality are the same. So this is where kind of kids look at God as sort of this cosmic Santa Claus in the sky. God's good, devil bad. There's a very basic level of understanding of God. Then when you get to the next stage, and you look at the mythical literal stage, whoops, trying to get the pen here. Mythical literal, so this is a middle to late childhood. Now, the point at which this happens in your life, it doesn't necessarily have to be at this at middle to late childhood. It just typically is. So this stage is where it says you have more logical and concrete thought. However, there's a tendency toward literal interpretation of religious stories. And God is very much like a father figure. So this is where you're kind of get involved with myth. So the Genesis story, Genesis 2 and 3 about Adam and Eve, you follow it pretty literally. You don't see the allegory. You don't see the symbolism. And that's how we learn about, our faith, through the stories, through the myths, through the legends. Now, when you get to stage 3, this is called the synthetic conventional faith, and it usually happens around adolescence. So stage 3 is typically around puberty, but many adults, Fowler found, didn't move beyond this stage. So it isn't, again, sort of like the sacraments. The sacraments, sometimes, like, I didn't get baptized till I was 14. I didn't get confirmation till I was 25. Sometimes the stages of development and faith development happen at different times in different people's lives. But they all, no matter when it happens, they tend to have these characteristics. So this is when you have even more ability to have abstract thought, but at the same time, you're also, this is when you look for your identity, is you look to the other. So teenagers aren't looking to their parents anymore, they're looking to their peers. So this is where you have the ability, you're looking to an authority outside yourself. This is where confirmation happens, because this is when you're looking at, who am I? Where do I fit in? And so this is where you get confirmed, you become part of the church, but it's also a time where it's unexamined. So a lot of this is where a lot of just typical traditional churchgoers end up staying. So it's important to be part of the church. You're Catholic, but your faith is still unexamined. You're not really questioning it. You don't really have the idea that you may not even really be conscious of having chosen something. This might be a little different for Catholics because of our understanding of confirmation. But this is where, a lot of people find themselves. They're Catholic. They may not even question it. And this is, before you have kind of like that identity crisis. So the next phase would be the next phase 4 is the individualistic reflective phase, and reflective is a really important part here. So this is usually in your college years, in your 20s. So it says, for the first time, individuals are capable of taking full responsibility for their religious beliefs, and in-depth exploration of values and religious belief is carried out. So this is where you start to question. This is where you start to question your faith. So notice, questioning your faith, That's a normal part of faith development. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, I question my faith, that means I'm not a good person of faith. No, the questioning is part of developing your faith. So at this stage, this is where when you question your faith, you could kind of go one of two ways. You either demythologize, which means you're able to use allegory. So rather than taking everything literal, like you did in stage 2, or not feeling like you could question it in stage 3, in the reflective stage, you say, okay, what do these stories really mean? What do they mean to me? How does this relate to my real life? And so you're able to now understand the stories more as allegories. Or you could go the other direction. You could reject. If you don't have the ability to think allegorical, you might leave the faith. Or just continue to question. So you kind of could go one of two ways there. That's where a lot of, and some people will stay this way forever. They'll never really deal and come to a kind of a peace. So there's an emergence of your own self, your own identity here, and your own kind of acceptance of your faith and interpretation. Next stage, stage 5, conjunctive faith. This is like middle adulthood. You become more open to paradox and opposing viewpoints. It stems from an awareness of one's finitude and limitations. So this is midlife. So rather than being either or, you can be both and. I have, you can understand that the story of Adam and Eve is both a story about origins, but also an allegory about the nature of mankind. You begin to dialogue with other faiths and learn that, you know what, there's truth in all religions. Not everything in every religion is true, but now you're open to dialogue. In the questioning phase, you may not be ready for that. In this phase, you don't even think to question and ask, about truth from other faiths. So you also, again, accept paradox and realize that paradox is part of understanding truth, is being open to paradox. Paradox is intrinsic to truth, and you become accepting of that. And you may return to your original symbols and stories, but you won't put them in a box. You won't necessarily take them literally. And now all of a sudden the stories of the Bible kind of open up for you. And then finally, and again, this isn't evaluative, stage 6, the universalizing faith, typically middle to late adulthood. There's a transcending of belief systems to achieve a sense of openness and with all being. And conflicting events are no longer viewed as paradoxes. So very few people ever make it to this stage. This is where, for example, Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa, Teresa of Calcutta, were at, where the phrase that's sometimes used from a Christian context that is that you're in the world but not of the world, that you've kind of transcended to this high level of consciousness. So again, this isn't evaluative. It's not as if you don't get to stage 6, you're not a good, faithful person. No, most of us will never get there. But what we see with let's kind of sum up here. What we see with Erickson's stages of faith development is, again, just like with what we were looking at in Erickson, we're recognizing that faith isn't static, that it grows and changes over time. And as Catholics, don't we know that? We have different sacraments given to us by Jesus to recognize our growth in our faith. In early childhood, we baptize our children so that they can begin getting their faith, begin instruction. We teach little kids the Bible stories so they know the myths and stories of our religion. And then as you get older, there are more opportunities. We do confirmation at this stage because this is the stage where you're looking for an identity. And Jesus wanted you to identify himself with the church. As you get older and become more yourself, that's when, you have more relationships, and you have the opportunity either to live the married life as your vocation, or perhaps for men, become priests, or if you're a girl, you can enter a religious order, or become a consecrated virgin. And then, it kind of recognizes the idea that, it wasn't until the 80s that Fowler came up with this idea that our faith grows and changes over time. Well, as Catholics, we'd say, yeah, we know that. That's why we have 7 sacraments, because Jesus is meeting us where we are in our human development with spiritual tools, because that's what the sacraments are about, grace. At each stage, Jesus has a tool, a spiritual sacrament that gives us the tools to not only develop again as people, but also as souls and people of faith. I think it's really kind of a cool thing. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is part 2 of the classwork. So we're going to do a little check for understanding, see how you're doing. I'm going to give you the chance to work with Fowler and Erickson's developmental theories. So this assignment is on PowerSchool, but I also gave you hard copies for this as well. So if you're absent, this does need to be made up. So I'll show you what the handouts look like in a second. What you're going to do, and you can work with your team, just make sure to record your own answers. I'm going to give you a chart of Erickson and a chart of Fowler. And then you will have a sheet, a handout that has these questions on it. And you're just going to fill it out, hard copy, and turn it in after we talk about it. Where do the sacraments typically fall on each man's timeline? So you can mark it on your chart. So actually mark up the chart. So where would you put them on each timeline? And then consider your own experience and knowledge of the sacraments. Is there a relationship between the scientific analysis of the human development and Catholic life lived in the sacraments? So what do you think? What's the connection? And then in what ways do the sacraments satisfy the human need for growth and development to be truly fulfilled and happy? So remember, one of the things that Erickson pointed out was that we need certain things at different times in our lives to develop and be happy and normal people. And one of the things he noticed was the social impact. That at certain stages, mom is important. At certain stages, both parents are important. So, how does this play out kind of in our religious life, in our faith life? So if you're having a difficult time, talk it out with a classmate. For example, if you've never experienced any of the sacraments personally, you might ask some of your friends, like, well, what was it like? How do you think this works? So this you're going to do, again, on a hard copy and turn in. I'm going to show you what the handouts look like right now, and then just sum it up. Okay, so this is what the handout looks like. If you look at this here, you can see that these are those questions you're supposed to be answering. The point values are here. And then it says you can work with a partner. So you'll write your answers here and turn it in. And so this is the handout. And now let me show you the charts I was referring to. Okay, so here's the Fowler chart. I know you can't read it here, it's too small, but you're going to get a hard copy of this. So if you were absent, this is what we did in class. Read through his chart, mark up where you think the different phases are, and you could get a little more detail about it. And then you can answer the questions. So look at in more detail his stages. All right, and this is the Erickson chart. Whoops, I'm moving it around. So again, I realize you can't read this text, but you'll be able to read it on the handout. And again, read through it in more detail so you can process this information, not just verbally and orally, but also through reading it. And you can, again, say, well, I think baptism fits here or marriage fits here, and kind of try to see the connection between human development and faith development. And again, if you were absent, make this up. You might want to get notes from someone. And now the last thing I'm going to do is just sum up why was this important. All right, so this is just a summary to say why was this important, what should I take away? First of all, we learned that from the psychological studies of Erickson, to be a happy, healthy human person, you grow and develop over time. And we need our culture in order to do that. He really emphasized the role that other people play in helping us become happy, healthy people. So that's right here. Humans are highly social, and we require a community to help us develop. That's why Jesus gave us a church, because he knew what it was like to be a human being. He has the experience of being fully human and fully divine. So what's the connection to the sacraments? The 7 sacraments help Catholics grow in their faith and relationship with God as they develop as persons over time. There is a pretty strong connection between the psychological development of a person and where the sacraments hit. So when the early church fathers were designing the sacraments after being given the authority by Jesus to do so, they didn't know anything about psychological development. But remember, the church has always been guided by the Holy Spirit. The church fathers may not have known, but the Holy Spirit did. So as the church has been guided throughout the centuries, the Holy Spirit has made sure that the sacraments meet us exactly where we need them. And then finally, that's kind of what I was saying right now. Jesus and the Holy Spirit, Jesus is God made man. He gave us the sacraments because he understood human nature. He knew what we're like. He knew that we needed the community. He knew that we needed hands-on. It wasn't enough just to say that God is with us, that he gives us signs and symbols so we can experience him. So that's kind of the takeaway from this lesson. If you have any questions, just let me know. And again, if you are absent, make sure to make up any work from your absence. Thank you.